Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Navigating Legislative Trends to Protect Local Revenue. My name is Allie Maynard and I'll be your host today. This session is designed to protect critical insights into the legislative landscape and strategies to safeguard and maximize local revenue streams. We're joined by a panel of experts who bring decades of experience in legislative advocacy and local government operations. Now let me introduce you to our speakers. We have two experts from Precision Advocacy with us today, first being Amy Ogorin-Jenkins, President and founder of Precision Advocacy and a distinguished legislative advocate with over 30 years of legislative, public affairs, and regulatory experience at the federal, state, and local levels. Amy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Allie.
And Nicole Werleman, legislative advocate specializing in budget and policy matters affecting local governments. Nicole?
Thanks so much for having me as well.
And Fran Mancia, advisory board member here at Avenue Insights and Analytics. He's known for his impactful legislative advocacy for local tax revenue protection. Fran, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Tom Adams, Director of Sales and Use Tax Audit at Avenue Insights and Analytics, with over 20 years of experience in municipal government and 10 years experience with district and sales and use tax auditing for California governments. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Holly.
And before we get started today, I just wanted to give you all a high-level overview of Avenue Insights and Analytics. For over 40 years, Avenue has been a trusted partner to state and local governments across all 50 states. With a team of over 850 experts, we provide tailored solutions to analyze, manage, and protect local revenue. From revenue administration to managed services and revenue enhancement services, Avenue is committed to addressing the operational challenges facing today's local governments. Now let's move into our agenda today. We'll be covering all of our topics today. We'll start with a review of legislative activity from 2024, and then the impact of elections on governments. We'll also dive into a preview of California's 2025 legislative priorities, and at the end, we'll have some time for an open Q&A session to address any questions you may have during our discussion today. You'll notice in the chat feature on YouTube, you can submit your questions throughout the webinar. If we don't get to your questions, we'll reach out to you after the webinar. And with that, we'll move into the legislative process overview, and I'll hand it over to you, Amy and Nicole.
Thank you so much, Allie. For our legislative update today, we're going to do a quick review of the legislative process, the governor's actions on bills this year as compared to historical trends, as well as review some of the bills we anticipate will impact your jurisdictions in the coming years. The legislative process for the 2025-26 session began on December 2nd with the swearing in of the new legislators, which was also the first opportunity for them to introduce legislation this year. So far, just a few days in, we have a little over 100 legislative vehicles introduced. Once February 21st, the bill introduction deadline hits us, we anticipate more like 2,000 bills. These bills have to remain in print for a minimum of 30 days before being considered in the policy committees, and then they move to policy committee and, as appropriate, appropriations committees. We anticipate that policy committees will be in full swing by March. And then in early May, bills in the first House will wrap up consideration in their policy committees, be heard in appropriations, and move to the floor of the Senate or Assembly. They have to move from their House of Origin by June 6th in 2025, and then they start the process all over again in the second House. At the end of August, they have to have passed through both the policy committees and appropriations committees. and then they need to be sent to the governor by September 12th for his consideration. After that point, he's got until October 12th to sign or veto all the legislation. Next slide, please. Governor Gavin Newsom wrapped up his review of legislation for 2024 on September 30th. He acted on just over 1,200 bills, which is the highest number of bills that he has received in his 6 years in office. He signed 1,017 into law, vetoed 189, and the veto rate was about 15.7%, so just a touch higher than the last 10 years average of 15%. As in prior years, vetoes were largely focused on budget. Many of his veto messages mentioned that in order to sign various policies into law, they need to be considered as part of the budget process. Next slide, please. All right, now we're headed into some specific bills. So this year under sales and use taxes, the big bill chaptered into law was AB 2854, a transparency bill authored by Jackie Irwin. The measure requires cities and counties to provide information to the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, as well as in each individual jurisdiction's website relating to agreements resulting in the direct or indirect payment, transfer, diversion, or rebate of Bradley Burns sales and use tax revenues. The legislature has really been interested in identifying how widespread rebate agreements are and how much in tax revenues are redirected from local jurisdictions as a result of the agreements. Fran has been following CDTFA's regulatory process pretty closely and has an update to share with us here.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. I think this is an important topic that many of you guys will be familiar with. City Manager Working Group has been in place for a couple of years looking at e-commerce transaction, warehouse transactions, and rebates as a whole. And how do we modernize potentially, or how do we make sure it's fair and evenly distributed, things of that type. And I think the important thing to note on AB 2854, it requires reporting things like the names of businesses you're doing work with, the total dollars rebated, the origin date of the agreements, the termination dates of the agreements, methodology for calculating how much is shared. And it's really important to understand that this is all incentives of any kind. And to read from this the section is really important. Rebated sales and use tax revenues means any direct or indirect payment, transfer, diversion, or rebate of any tax revenue from the imposition of local tax to any person pursuant to payment. So this isn't just for e-commerce, it's not just for warehouses, but if you have an incentive for a car dealership to be in your community, or a large retailer or a big box retailer, you'll have to report those as well. I think most people thought this would just apply to the e-commerce, so it's really important to understand that. There was prior to this bill being passed, there was already a requirement that cities should post their agreements on their websites. This one takes it a step further. You have to coordinate it with the CDTFA, and if you don't meet the filing deadline of April 1st of each year, they can impose fines. So for 1 day to 180 days past the filing deadline, which is April 30th of each year, you can be fined up to $1,000 per day. And if it gets up to 180 days or more, they can fine you $4,000 a day or more. So clearly those are large amounts of revenue potentially that people could be fined. So I think it's important to pay attention. You may have gotten some information from CDTFA recently that they're holding an interested party meeting on December 12th around this, whether or not they need an emergency declarations to implement this in time for the reporting requirement of April 1st or not. Cal Cities, in conjunction with CDTFA, will be putting on some webinars in January on this topic, and we'll be involved in those as well. But also the last thing to mention is this will be a topic at the City Managers Conference in February, where I'll be one of the panelists discussing more of this. So just really wanted to put it on your radar. This is something that's going to be a big imposition on cities in terms of reporting requirements, and there's a heavy penalty if you don't meet it. So I think I'll stop there and pass it back to Nicole. Thank you. Or Amy, whoever.
Thank you. Thanks so much. One of the other high-profile bills that we wanted to mention, which was actually vetoed by the governor, but it has been a long process with this subject matter, was AB 52. So AB 52 by Tim Grayson was introduced in this legislative session after AB 1951 was vetoed in 2022. And both bills relate to tax exemptions for manufacturing, research, and development. However, AB 1951 was a particularly hard-fought bill for us because it would have provided a full sales and use tax exemption, which would have been an estimated $2 billion hit to local jurisdictions over the 5 years it would have been scheduled to be in effect. We advocated very hard against AB 1951, both with the legislature and then with the governor when he received it. And it was vetoed also for budgetary reasons. Additionally, AB 52 was introduced as an extension of 1951, and we followed it very, very closely because we were not going to deal with another 1951 if at all possible. It was ultimately amended to be a credit under personal income tax law and corporation tax law for the research development on and manufacturing equipment. AB 52 actually also ended up being vetoed by the governor for budgetary reasons, but we did not weigh in on that one as it would not have had impacts to local jurisdictions. And then one very high profile bill that I wanted to mention that didn't make it to the governor this year was SB 1494 by Steve Glazer. And this bill would have prohibited a local agency from entering into, renewing, or extending sales and use tax rebate agreements with retailers in exchange for locating in their jurisdiction. It would have also voided any of those agreements that they had already entered into on January 1st, 2030. This bill was primarily an issue for jurisdictions that utilize rebate agreements to attract economic development in their areas. Most locals wouldn't have been impacted by the change, so there was a lot of education done by the locals from such as the Inland Empire or other areas that use the rebate agreements to attract business. Due to all of the controversy, Senator Glazer was unable to obtain the needed votes to move SB 1494 off of the floor. However, discussions continue, and Fran, as he mentioned earlier, has been working with the Cal Cities City Manager Work Group, and they have been watching this bill closely as well as having further discussions.
Yeah, just to add on to what Nicole mentioned, the working group has completed its recommendations and will actually now go into an educational campaign around what does sales tax mean? How does it work? How does the current allocation methodologies work? What are the different facets of it? So in order to set up further discussions going forward, if any decisions are made around further recommendations or changes to legislation that might be before cities.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
Thank you. I'll take this one. So thank you, everybody, for the time today. I'm covering cannabis and housing and a few other slides going forward. So we'll start with bills related to cannabis and cannabis policy in 2024. There were a number of them. We're highlighting two here. The first is SB 1059 by Senator Steve Bradford. What this bill essentially did is it clarifies that the state's 15% excise tax is calculated based on gross receipts of cannabis products and does not capture any other tax or fee imposed by a local jurisdiction. This came out of a situation in the city of Los Angeles where the city was applying its gross receipts tax at the very, very end. So all of the taxes were being combined. And so this really says that you cannot do that. In fact, you just have to levy that 15% excise tax based on the product cost. So that was a clarifying bill that was signed by the governor. The other bill that I wanted to highlight relates to actual cannabis licensing. So a lot of jurisdictions permit different than the state. What this bill would do or does is it establishes a combined license. There will be some regulations that will come out that will further clarify this, but essentially if you are a licensed cannabis operator in a jurisdiction and you are conducting multiple activities in a contiguous area, so in the same property or contiguous premises, that operator can apply for a combined license. Now, the reason this may or may not be important to local governments is the expectation is this will speed up the licensing process and also simplify the licensing process. There's also some discussion and theory that this will ultimately reduce some of the licensing fees at the state level, which are currently being evaluated. So we wanted to highlight those two cannabis bills. Moving into housing, just for time purposes, I'm not going to cover all the bills, but wanted to highlight, but encourage you to please look at the bills that we have flagged here for you. The two I want to highlight first is AB 3093 by Assemblymember Ward. This bill introduces two new income categories into housing law. So acutely low income, which is defined as households earning less than 15% of the area median income, and then extremely low income, which is households earning less than 30% of area median income. Their concerns that were raised while this bill was moving through the process is that the bill provides no additional funding to local jurisdictions to develop plans to meet these new income categories. There's no implementing strategies to address homelessness housing needs or supporting the construction of affordable housing, but it does require these new income categories to be incorporated into the housing needs of people experiencing homeless into their RHNA allocation and their housing elements. So that's one I thought was really important to flag. The second one I want to highlight is SB 1037 by Senator Scott Wiener. This bill grants the California Attorney General enhanced authority to enforce housing laws, particularly around housing elements and ministerial approvals of housing development projects. So this includes imposing penalties for noncompliance with state mandated housing element revisions and enforcing laws that require local governments to approve housing related planning or permitting applications ministerially. Just for those of you who are tracking, we're seeing this trend with this administration where I think that will continue in budget and legislative policy where if locals are not meeting housing element requirements or adhering to new policy mandates coming from the state, you're going to see more enforcement authority and then also potential clawbacks in funding. It's just an overarching policy that we're beginning to see, and SB 1037 is I think one of many bills and policy areas that'll be debated as we go into 2025. So those are the two I wanted to highlight in the area of housing. Next slide, please. So as we look at labor and employment law, there's one we also wanted to highlight, AB 2561 McKinner. This bill aims to address staffing shortages in local public agencies through the following provisions. So first, it's going to require annual public hearings. So agencies must present the status of job vacancies and recruitment efforts publicly at least once per fiscal year, with a focus on timing before the final budget is adopted. It also requires action plans for critical vacancies. So for instance, for bargaining units experiencing a 20% or higher vacancy rate persisting over 90 days, public agencies must develop and implement a plan to address these vacancies. And then it requires employee organizational input. So recognizing employee organizations that can provide information and recommendations at the particular public hearing. So the rationale that the author cited was that staffing shortages are obviously negatively impacting public service delivery, and that this is kind of a way to better inform the public and essentially motivate agencies to fill those vacancies. Now, we certainly recognize that there's a lot of problems within the public sector, whether we're talking about state or local. So that was kind of the basis for some of the opposition to this bill is how are we actually solving the problem of recruiting public employees? Nonetheless, this bill was ultimately signed by the governor. So locals need to be thinking about how they need to implement this bill going forward. Moving into the transportation realm, wanted to highlight SB 768 by Senator Caballero. This bill directs the Department of Housing and Community Development in collaboration with local authorities and stakeholders to conduct a comprehensive study of the use of vehicle miles traveled as a metric under CEQA. So this study will have to be published by January 1, 2028. And the study must include the feasibility of implementing VMT mitigation measures across geographic regions, and then the impacts of using VMT metrics on housing development and transportation planning. Last but not least, I'm sure many of you have heard about AB 98 by Assemblymember Juan Carrillo. This is a bill that was introduced in the final week of the legislative session. In fact, it was debated within the final 72 hours of the legislative session. What this does is this essentially establishes a statewide criteria or set of criteria for the approval of new or expanded logistics centers. Now, I can tell you we can have an entire webinar just on AB 98 implementation and all of the concerns that have been raised. So an Avenue, with the help of Precision, has done a lot of extensive analysis on this. So what this requires is buffer zones. So it establishes mandates, specific distance between logistics centers and sensitive receptors, such as residential areas and schools. It requires all cities and communities to update their circulation elements to designate truck routes. And it also directs the South Coast Air Quality Management District within certain sensitive areas to study the environmental impacts of logistics centers. Again, this was a very, very hotly debated bill in the final 3 days. We are anticipating some cleanup going into 2025, but strongly encourage you to review this bill, particularly as it relates to your general plan, because you will have to update your circulation element.
Okay, thanks, Amy Nicole. For our next section, we're going to go through the election's impact on local governments. Big election, a lot of not only state legislators, but bond measures. So if you guys want to give us a quick overview of what went on with state and local elections, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, with the elections having just been certified, the data here probably will be updated in time, but we saw about 700 and more local measures on the ballot. Indications suggest about a 72% passage rate. At the statewide level, we saw a number of propositions. We'll highlight 3 that passed. The first being Prop 2, which is the school and college facilities bond. This allows the state to issue $10 billion in general obligation bonds to improve and expand K through 12 and community college facilities. Key projects include upgrading science and vocational education spaces, improving health and safety, and supporting small and disadvantaged districts through financial hardship grants. So that was one that passed pretty easily. The second, Proposition 4, this is the climate bond. So this authorizes $10 billion in bonds for projects addressing climate risks, including wildfire prevention, water resilience, and coastal protection. Specific allocations and buckets include 3.8 billion for safe drinking water and about 1.9 billion roughly for wildfire prevention. So both of these bonds, there's a lot of discussion about those funding buckets, and there'll be additional information on how you can access that funding as you know, as things continue at the state level. Also wanted to highlight Proposition 36. So this actually handily passed. It was one of the first propositions that was called the night, election night. Passed with over just, I think, a little over 70% of the vote. But this reclassifies specific drug and theft crimes as felonies, including stricter penalties for fentanyl trafficking and new treatment mandatory penalty options for repeat drug offenders. So this is another one that was hotly debated in the legislature. There were actually efforts to consider other avenues to trying to address retail theft, but ultimately Proposition 36 made it to the ballot and passed handily by the voters. So one thing that's not noted in the PowerPoint here is that we did have a ballot measure that did fail passage, and that was a proposition around housing bonds and the lowering the threshold to approve affordable housing. That measure did fail. But as you look at some of the passage rate for local bond measures, we certainly saw a very successful passage rate. Next, anyone have anything they want to add here?
I just had a question. I know that we have a lot of new legislators, and we also have a historic number, from what I've heard, of women legislators in the Capitol this year. I'm wondering if you could say a few things about having sort of a new crop of folks in Sacramento, as well as historic number of women, and what impacts we may see from those this year.
Well, actually, I think it might be in the next slide.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm glad you mentioned it. So, so we have a lot of new changes in the state legislature, and Tom, as you noted, some really historic changes. So first off, just this last Monday, and Nicole mentioned this earlier, we swore in, the legislature swore in 32 new members. That's 23 assembly members and 9 senators, with significant increase in female representation and representation of different communities of color. So we will see the highest number of elected women senators ever, and so that's really exciting for a lot of us. But definitely some historic changes in terms of legislative composition. In addition, the Assembly Democrats retained their supermajority. So there's essentially 60 plus Assembly Democrats, and then Senate also retained their majority, but we did lose a few. So the Assembly, we actually lost 2 Democrats, and in the Senate, we lost 1. But ultimately, the supermajorities remain intact. And then we also have 2 vacancies now with the swearing in of the new class. So in terms of vacancies, we need to replace Vince Fong, who succeeded Kevin McCarthy and is now representing the Bakersfield area in Congress. And then Senator Janet Nguyen from Orange County was just elected to the Board of Supervisors. So we'll have 2 vacancies that we will still have to fill. But the legislative composition is interesting. Another factoid that is in this slide is that 70% of the legislature has less than 4 years of experience. So when going into the 2025 session and thinking about bills, there's going to be a significant amount of education that I think everybody is going to need to engage in. So whether it's Avenue or it's partners like Precision Advocacy, which is Nicole and I, there's going to be a lot of education required going into this coming year. A couple things I also want to highlight as it relates to the federal dynamics. The governor, when the new class was sworn in, concurrently what happened on Monday is essentially the governor called a special session, and that aims to address anticipated federal actions by the incoming Trump administration. So the special session largely is focusing on protecting California policies such as civil rights, reproductive rights, climate change and immigration. And in furtherance of that special session, again, this all occurred concurrently just this last Monday, December 2nd, there were 3 bills introduced. And what those bills aim to do is increase funding for legal defense to, again, address statewide policies that may run afoul with the incoming administration. So one bill provides up to $25 million for the Department of Justice for legal defense and affirmative litigation. Another bill provides $500,000 for immediate Department of Justice federal litigation expenses. And then there's a $35 million proposal that would provide legal aid and defense, including support for local civil prosecutors, immigrant rights, and data security. So all of that occurred again when the legislature reconvened on December 2nd. And while those bills have been introduced, the final outcome and the funded spending that will be authorized for legal defense will be negotiated in the next couple of months. So we anticipate January in all likelihood. Anything anyone else want to add here? There was a lot of activity that occurred over the last week or so. So
I just wanted to add that during Trump's last presidency, California sued the federal government more than 100 times. So I think it's safe to say we can anticipate a lot of activity coming from the agent's office.
I also wanted to say a few words. Obviously, we have had a Trump administration in the past, so I think that's the best indication of what we might see going forward. There's obviously a difference between the rhetoric that we hear sort of going into 2025 and what might be the reality. I think this president, more so than most, likes to sort of stake positions in terms of rhetoric as a potential negotiating tactic for various policies that he may want to see. There's been a lot of talk about tariffs. When we did see, more tariffs under the first administration, those tariffs didn't really change much into the Biden administration. We are now talking about them again. I just wanted to sort of highlight that the president has some ability executively to make changes such as tariffs to the economy. There's a lot of things that the president does not have control over. So the president obviously doesn't control the price of bacon. The president doesn't control the price of gasoline, doesn't control interest rates and inflation and unemployment and those sort of things. So some of these, topics, there tends to be either, on one side that it's the sky is falling, and on the other, Trump's going to save us from all these different things. And I think the truth is the president has limited capability other than tariffs and some other specialized areas to affect the overall economy. Here in California, I think as Amy and Nicole had mentioned, our governor and legislature have taken a very oppositional stance in a lot of different areas. So I think in terms of the economic impacts, it's still uncertain. There's a lot of unknowns out there. Tariffs is going to be one thing. The tax cuts extension is going to be another big negotiation, and how that will influence things. Immigration is going to be a hot topic, of course, and that affects us here in California. But there's a lot of talk, but as to when we ultimately sort of see those policies impact the overall economy, there's usually a lag time, and often what's ultimately done is quite different from what may have been talked about. So stay tuned on these. Again, we'll be paying attention to a lot of these topics as we move forward. But the first administration wasn't that different from the prior administration, and the president has limited impacts on the overall macroeconomy as well as the state economy.
I just want to add, I think Tom sums it up really, really well. And I think part of our job here is to provide as much information along the way. And of course, we publish legislative updates and policy updates for our clients and interested parties throughout the year. And many times we'll include in that not just analysis, but recommendations on next steps that your jurisdiction may want to take into account. And I think we'll have continued dialogues like this because there's so many unknowns. And our goal here is to provide you the latest and greatest as quickly and as timely as we can. So look forward to more conversations along those same lines.
All right, now we're going to transition into 2025 legislative preview. What might we see on the horizon?
Well, I think you can be guaranteed we're going to see a lot of uncertainty, and that's what a lot of folks are talking about. But as the legislature did reconvene on December 2nd, one of the other issues that I think we were all relieved to see as a focus is affordability concerns. So we're preparing for challenges posed by the Trump administration, but Democratic leadership is also acknowledging that issues like housing costs, energy prices, infrastructure improvements are really high on the list for residents in California. The Senate Pro Tem is looking at homelessness, and the Assembly Speaker has mentioned an energy package to lower energy prices. And the package was introduced or partially introduced earlier this year. However, they didn't act on it during this year's session. And so we can anticipate some conversations there in 2025. Looking at the budget, the Legislative Analyst's Office, who advises the legislature on the budget, is estimating that the budget's about balanced going into the 2025-26 budget year. Spending's been higher than anticipated through the 2024 Budget Act, but revenues have also been higher. However, what the legislature and administration are really going to be looking at is that in out years, there is a remaining structural deficit that will need to be addressed. The legislature and administration will also continue to focus on climate policies, housing, homelessness, and those are big issues for local jurisdictions, just because in many instances, the costs of change are passed down to the jurisdictions. I think it's important to note that about 1/3 of the state budget comes from the federal government. The 75% of that is for health and human services programs. So just looking at the 2024 budget, $115 billion came from the federal government for health and human services, $8.5 billion for labor and workforce, $8 billion for K-12 education, $7.4 billion for higher education, and then $6.8 billion for transportation. And then you've got about $7 billion additional thrown in there for miscellaneous. So the administration and legislature definitely need to keep an eye on it, and certainly homelessness, environment, education, immigration will all be large budget areas in the coming year. And I can tell you also that looking at legislation, I want to say immigration, we already have five bills so far. We're real early in the process. All right, next slide, please.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So some of the anticipated legislation that we are looking at, we understand that this coming year, the League of California Cities, now Cal Cities, will sponsor legislation to increase the transaction and use tax cap statewide. This is in line with similar efforts as highlighted AB 3259 and AB 2443 that were chaptered earlier this year. It's uncertain as of this moment, although some of my colleagues might have an update as to whether the the cap, what the increase in the cap will be modeled after prior legislation. I would note that in 2015, then Assembly Member Kevin Mullen, who's now in Congress, authored AB 464, which was ultimately vetoed by then Governor Jerry Brown. That bill would increase the maximum combined rate of all transactions and use taxes that could be levied from 2% to 3%. The governor at that time was uncomfortable providing for a increase and vetoed that bill. So I think right now the league is currently determining whether to model it after that prior measure, AB 464, or possibly allow a 2% increase for each local agency. So I think a lot of that is still under discussion. There are two authors that have been identified, though nothing confirmed at this time, but it's something that we'll be working in partnership with the league on, and we'll keep you informed of any updates. The other issue that does anyone have anything to add?
I think, Amy, I'll just jump in. I think that's a great synopsis. I think it's really interesting that more and more jurisdictions are going out for transaction use tax measures. In November, the recent election, many passed, and they're also passing in an overwhelming form. I think the compelling argument here, this is an opportunity for local jurisdictions and their constituents to determine if they would like to impose a tax upon themselves. I think things are getting economically a little more challenging in terms of generating new revenue. So this has become a very popular means for locals to generate revenue. And there's several hundred out there at this time. Many cities might have more than one of these as well. So I think this is, and it's also a good way to handle some of the changes around the economy and how things are taxed and how people are making transactions. So it's got a lot of popularity, a lot of people. And I think we're seeing, the other thing to say is we're seeing jurisdictions that may be considered more conservative, as well as cities that may be more progressive, are all passing them overwhelmingly. It's not really about tax or no tax. I think it's something that if people feel compelled that it will help their communities, they're willing to do it in a bipartisan fashion, which to me is very refreshing in this day and age.
Amy, do we have any indication from the governor's office as to where he might stand on this issue? Part of the reason I ask is if a city's sort of interested in raising the cap, should they pursue sort of legislation separately, or should we try to read the tea leaves of where the governor is and perhaps put our eggs into the, overall raising the cap basket, or what is your thought on that?
I think that's a fair question, Tom. And I think that's probably one that we'll need to direct to Cal Cities. Obviously, we're prepared to provide some ground support, but I think they're in the exploratory phase right now to gauge where this administration is. And I've not heard anything specific as of yet. And oftentimes the administration won't engage early, though. Nicole, I don't heard anything. Yeah,
I have not.
Yeah, I think if I was recommending individual cities, I would defer to the broader tax cap concept, and then go from there once additional feedback is received, not only from the administration but also from the legislature.
Yeah,
and better assess. The next area that just going back, if that's okay, to the prior slide. Two more issues I just wanted to point out, and then I'll actually defer to Fran on the short-term rentals. But first off, we are actually approaching an expiration of authorization to levy a utility users tax on prepaid wireless telephones. So this is one that this is a bill that was actually co-sponsored by Avenue back in 2020. That provided a 5-year extension to levy UUT on prepaid wireless. That extension is expiring at the end of this year. So after December 31st, 2025, we will not be able to impose UUT on prepaid mobile. And so we are currently exploring whether we need to extend that tax, that authorization to apply UUT, and are actually looking for feedback from our local jurisdictions. When the original bill was introduced back in 2020, we had a lot of support from our local government partners, but we are currently in a fact-finding phase trying to assess whether that has generated significant revenue for local jurisdictions and whether we need to, again, explore an extension. So that's something we want to flag for all of you and welcome and appreciate your feedback. And then there's some development on short-term rentals that I think Fran has a little bit more information on.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Yeah, there's some conversations around a piece of legislation to sort of, if you will, allow cities to crack down further on short-term rentals that might take place in their communities. And as you can see in the bullet, one of the key provisions would allow cities to have local auditing authority. In previous years, there's been a lot of conversation about how do we get some of the short-term rental companies, the Airbnbs and others, to provide data to us to understand how much is being collected. And that's been a point of contention where confidentiality and numerics was an issue. So if this measure was passed in the form that I'm hearing about, it would have local auditing authority, and it would basically provide further enforcement actions for locals against unlicensed operators. The version I'm hearing about would really be optional for cities. They would not have to do it, but it would provide them a platform for further enforcement actions against short-term rentals that are not properly registered and paying information. And it would require them to provide more data than they're currently providing, such as parcel numbers, property tax parcel numbers, assessed property value numbers, and further information about the revenues generated. So something we'll keep an eye on and keep you informed about in the coming weeks.
Great. Just as sort of a wrap up, we wanted to thank everyone again for joining us for the webinar today, and especially thank our clients that we have worked with through the years for your partnership. We view ourselves as sort of your eyes and ears in Sacramento with the assistance of Amy and Nicole and Precision Advocacy and Fran's efforts with the league and our various policy updates and other kind of programs that we work with our local government partners throughout the year. So thank you again for your partnership with us. We remain committed to protecting municipal revenues on your behalf. And again, we encourage you to reach out to us if there are issues that you're interested in or anything that came up today that you would like more information. Please let us know. Is there anything else there, Fran, that you wanted to add?
No, I think that's a great summary, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, but our goal is to continually provide you current information. Please reach out to us as we always have in the past, and please provide your feedback. We're really looking for that around prepaid wireless and the transaction use tax, some of the key items we talked about for 2025. We're here to work with you along with your advocates in your communities and your cities to work closely. I also want to mention that we really value our collaboration with cities, but and also with associations that represent you. We're also closely aligned with many of the lobbyists who work in governmental advocates who work for your jurisdiction. So I think that's an important thing, and we look forward to doing this more frequently with you, and look forward to seeing you at some of the events coming up in the near future as well.
So we did get a couple questions in during the discussion today, one of which is how the state might deal with the decline in sales tax from gasoline, as well as how the state will deal with the related decline in gas tax revenues to maintain roads.
No, that's a great question, Allie, and I think it's something that's important to discuss here. And by the way, in some of our economic updates, we've been talking about this, whether it was at the League of Cities annual conference, and I know it'll come up at the Municipal Finance Institute in the near future and other events. But what we're really seeing is a real decline in gas sales due to the fact that there's such an increase in the purchase of electric vehicles. So just for an example, in 2022, right at the end of the pandemic, 7% of all the sales tax in California was coming from gasoline sales. This year, it's going to be down by 5.5%. So the total revenue from gas sales is coming down. Instead of being 7%, it'll be 5%. But even more compelling is by 2030, it's going to be down by 44% from that high in 2020. So gas revenues are coming down very dramatically. At the same time, electric vehicle sales are up. Just a couple of statistics around that. 21% of the current new car purchases in California now are electric. Another 13% are hybrids. Another 3% are plug-ins. So about 40% of the new car sales in California now are electric-based, which means they don't need gas. So therefore, the gas revenues are going down and gas sales are going down. So the question becomes, how do we address that? And candidly, I think best solution, but it's also the hardest solution, is to look at some type of sales tax or tax reform. The question is there an appetite for that type of thing? But, these type of changes are coming based on how people consume and how they operate. But that's really the driver for the decline in sales tax revenues, is the increase in electric vehicle purchases. And the other thing is those are expected to continue to increase in California and across the country. The interesting part of it is California is a bit isolated in this. Most of the electric vehicle sales are taking place in California. Across the country, California makes up 33% of the total electric vehicle sales across the country. So hope that helps answer a little bit.
Thank you, Fran. We did receive one other question. I think we have time for one more. And this is regards to Trump's policies. How are those policies might affect California and specifically local governments?
So there are quite a few different ways that they could impact California. Lots of uncertainty. I would say in terms of things like homelessness, not only cutting funding for homeless programs, but potentially blocking the state's Housing First framework. And the Housing First framework essentially says that you accept unhoused people, even if they're using drugs or alcohol. Another way would be for people in jurisdictions receiving healthcare through Medi-Cal. California receives billions and billions of dollars in funding and waivers for Medi-Cal healthcare, and so that could result in cutting people's healthcare or access to. Additionally, we're looking at environmental pieces, so opening more federal land to oil and gas drilling, easing restrictions on methane emissions, repealing federal subsidies for solar, wind, and other renewable energy. One of the big ones is that he has pledged to shut down the Department of Education. So I'm not sure that would be a tremendous change and a tremendous impact on California's education system. And then one of the ones that folks are talking about a lot are changes to immigration. And any sort of mass deportation is going to really incapacitate the agriculture and construction industry in California, and greatly impact our economy. And then I'd welcome anyone else's comments also.
I would just highlight again that it's all pretty uncertain. During the first administration, they were going to build the wall and have Mexico pay for it. And, there's a lot of talk, and I think they're kind of starting points to what things that might happen on the immigration side. It's going to be a lot easier to deal with people perhaps that are incarcerated than perhaps, going out and chasing down people out there working in the fields, et cetera. I think there's also competing perhaps priorities about, inflation and perhaps, prices for agricultural work and that sort of thing. So, again, I think we've heard a lot at this point. We sort of know some of what they're, have said, but the rhetoric and the reality as to what is actually a real policy and what is an actual real achievable policy, I think it remains to be seen. Again, into the future. So, I think there is a lot of difference of opinion between, say what's the incoming federal administration and our current California administration, both governor and legislature. So, I think we can anticipate more fights ahead. But we also have, both from the business side as well as from the politics side, we have experience with sort of what, some of the administration's sort of tactics and involve and what how to deal with it. So, I think it's an evolving picture, but I don't think we necessarily need to think that the sky is falling at this point, and in the process we have a state government, local governments have their own regulations and legal sort of limits to their authority, and the federal government does as well. So it's going to be a 4 years of likely more fights between different jurisdictions, but we'll see what ultimately winds up happening on the ground.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom and Nicole. And with that, I want to wrap up today and thank you all for joining today's webinar, Navigating Legislative Trends to Protect Local Tax Revenue. And a special thank you to our panelists, Amy O'Gorham Jenkins, Nicole Wertelman, Fran Mancia, and Tom Adams, for sharing their expertise and insights. And their extensive knowledge has really provided us with critical perspectives on the legislative changes and opportunities facing local governments. And as we leave you today, we encourage you to continue monitoring the legislative developments and connecting with your peers to advocate for the policies that protect and enhance your community's revenue streams. And as Tom and Fran mentioned, at Avenue, we're proud to partner with the top industry experts like Precision Advocacy to ensure our clients have the most up-to-date information and tools to navigate the complexities of these legislative changes. For more information and additional resources, please visit avenueinsights.com or reach out directly to our team. And thank you all for